The city of Ur did not wake to the sun. It woke to the temple. Before merchants lifted their shutters, before soldiers tightened their leather straps, before the king himself rose from a cedar bed, a single figure had already been awake for hours, standing barefoot on cold stone, whispering words older than crowns. She was not a queen. She wore no armor. Yet no king ruled without her consent. High above Euphrates, the ziggurat of Nana loomed like a stairway carved for the gods. Its terraces glowed faintly in the dawn, washed in ash-pink light. At its summit stood the Priestess, the living bridge between heaven and earth. Her name was Enheduanna. History would remember her as a poet. Her contemporaries knew her as something far more dangerous. She was a daughter of Sargon of Akkad, the most powerful ruler the world had ever seen. But inside the temple, bloodline mattered less than belief. And belief, in Mesopotamia, was power in its purest form. Enheduanna did not command armies. She commanded legitimacy. When she lifted her hands in ritual, crops grew or failed. When she spoke the gods' will, cities prospered or fell into revolt. Kings could conquer by force, but they ruled only if the gods approved. And the gods did not speak to kings. They spoke to her. Below the ziggurat, the city of Ur stirred. Traders from distant lands arranged copper, lapis lazuli, and barley. Scribes prepared clay tablets. Soldiers waited for orders. None of them would hear the words Enheduanna whispered at dawn, but all of them would live with the consequences. She began the ritual slowly, deliberately. Incense curled into the morning air. Sacred oils glistened on her wrists. Her voice, steady and low, recited hymns not meant for common ears. These hymns were not prayers. They were contracts. In Mesopotamia, the gods did not love humanity. They bargained with it. And Enheduanna was the chief negotiator. Far below in the palace, messengers waited outside the king's chamber. A rebellion smoldered in the south. The question was simple. Would the gods support the king or abandon him? The answer would not come from the throne. It would come from the temple. When Enheduanna finished the ritual, she did not smile. She rarely did. Power like hers did not bring comfort. It brought responsibility measured in blood and silence. She turned toward the inner sanctuary, where only she was permitted to enter. Within that chamber stood no statue of a god. Only darkness, incense smoke, and a raised platform where divine was interpreted, not revealed. This was where kings were made, and unmade. Later that day, the king himself would climb the ziggurat steps, head bowed, crown removed. He would not speak until spoken to. He would not demand, only ask. Because in Mesopotamia, even the mightiest ruler understood a simple truth. A king without the priestess was only a man with soldiers, and soldiers could not rule without the gods. As Enheduanna descended from the sanctuary, scribes awaited her words. One sentence from her mouth would be etched into clay, copied, sent across cities, and treated as divine law. She paused. Outside, the wind shifted. A sign. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. The gods are watching, she said, and they are not yet satisfied. By nightfall, a city would burn. By morning, a king would kneel. And history would remember only the ruler, never the woman who controlled him. The streets of Ur were restless. Merchants whispered of missed shipments, soldiers of delayed patrols, and farmers of failing irrigation. Yet none dared speak openly of the real reason for the city's unease. That secret belonged to the temple and the woman who ruled it. Enheduanna's influence was subtle, yet absolute. She did not raise armies in the open. She did not wear a crown or brandish a sword. Instead, she wielded ritual, law, and sacred privilege. Every king who sought to solidify power in Akkad or Sumer had to answer to her. Her approval was the invisible thread that tied the mortal and divine. Without it, even the strongest ruler's hand faltered. Inside the ziggurat, she prepared a ceremony for the southern governors, men who controlled vast tracts of fertile land. The ritual was elaborate. Incense of cedar and myrrh, sacred hymns chanted in the oldest tongues, and offerings of grain and livestock to Nana, the moon god. But more than a spiritual observance, this ceremony was a statement. a message to every ruler who might challenge Sargon's dynasty. "The king is strong," Enheduanna murmured, lighting a series of oil lamps. "But strength without favor is brittle. Favor without obedience is meaningless." She moved gracefully through the inner sanctuary, her hands brushing over ceremonial tools, each marked with inscriptions no one but she could interpret. To the untrained eye, these were mere relics. To those who knew, they were instruments of influence. One ritual, one subtle gesture, could redirect grain shipments, provoke or quell uprisings, or legitimize a rebellion. Outside the sanctuary, a messenger arrived breathless, clutching a tablet. Enheduanna read it with narrowed eyes. The southern city of Lagash resisted tribute, questioning Sargon's authority. Most rulers would see a military problem. Enheduanna saw a spiritual imbalance. The city had not honored the moon god properly. Their festival offerings had been delayed. She summoned her assistant, a young acolyte trained in divination and the art of persuasion. "Prepare the tablet for the king," she said. "The gods are displeased. He must act." When the king read her words later that day, he did not argue. He did not delay. He marched south, bringing soldiers, yes, but more importantly, he carried the weight of divine will, transmitted solely through Enheduanna's voice. Without that authority, his campaign might have failed. With it, rebellion crumbled before the army even arrived. Enheduanna did not travel with armies. She did not fight, yet her power reshaped the landscape of Mesopotamia. She influenced trade, taxation, and diplomacy, determining which cities thrived and which withered. She mediated between kings and gods, the mortal and the immortal. Every city-state knew this, but none could challenge it openly. Her influence extended even into the sacred and intimate spheres. Priestesses like her were believed to hold sway over sexuality, fertility, and lineage, ensuring that kings produced heirs who were blessed by the gods, or cursed if disobedient. Marriages arranged in her name were political instruments. Marriages ignored could spell divine disfavor. One whispered word from the temple could undo years of political planning. Enheduanna's poetry and hymns, what history later celebrated, were more than literature. They were codified decrees, praising gods, denouncing enemies, and reinforcing the divine order. To recite her hymns in public was to affirm the ruler's legitimacy. To ignore them was to invite ruin. By sunset, the city of Uar had returned to relative calm. Traders counted coins, soldiers marched home, and farmers tended fields. But the unseen forces of power had moved that day. Cities had shifted allegiance. Generals had adjusted strategy. Even the king, sitting in his palace, felt the invisible weight of Priestess's hand guiding every decision. Enheduanna retired to her private chamber at the top of the ziggurat. Candlelight danced across clay tablets etched with sacred hymns and ritual instructions. Her eyes, weary yet vigilant, scanned the city below. Kings, generals, and governors might wield swords and decrees, but they could not escape her. They were instruments in her orchestration, unaware of the depth of her influence. The priestess's power was invisible, unacknowledged, absolute, and it was growing. Tomorrow, she would extend her reach beyond Uar, into Babylon, Akkad, and beyond. Kings would bend, governors would comply, and the gods, she believed, would watch and approve, because in Mesopotamia, true power did not lie in the crown. It lay in the hands of the woman who could shape kings, direct empires, and decide which cities flourished and which fell silent forever. The city of Lagash had long prided itself on independence. Its walls were strong, its canals well-tended, and its rulers stubborn. Yet when Enheduanna's influence extended beyond Uar, even Lagash could not resist the invisible threads of the temple. She did not march with soldiers. She did not issue threats. Instead, she called upon the most subtle yet potent tools of Mesopotamian authority: wealth, ritual, and alliances. In her private chamber, atop the terraces of the ziggurat, Enheduanna convened a council of high-ranking temple officials, scribes, and acolytes. Each had been trained not merely in ceremony, but in strategy, negotiation, and the nuances of divine legitimacy. "Lagash questions a king," she said quietly, letting her words settle like incense smoke. "They do not question Sargon alone. They question the gods. That is dangerous." A scribe, thin and pale, bowed. The temple could sanction military action. Enheduanna shook her head. A sword alone convinces only the fearful. We need obedience born of belief. Make them see that defiance is not rebellion against men. It is rebellion against heaven itself. The council moved to action. Enheduanna dictated hymns and prayers for Lagash, composed to be publicly displayed in the city's temples. Each hymn praised Nana and Inanna, while subtly denouncing those who defied divine order. The verses were poetry to the untrained ear, but to those who understood the sacred language, they were binding instructions. Next came the alliance network. Priestesses in neighboring cities, temple administrators, and trusted merchants were quietly informed that supporting Lagash's rebellion, or withholding tribute, would invite divine disfavor. Some received gifts of sacred oil, textiles, and silver. Others, warnings in whispered language, reminding them of what happened to those who defied temple authority in the past. It was not coercion. It was influence. By the time the southern governor of Lagash read the first clay tablet from UR, he already felt the weight of forces he could neither see nor resist. Enheduanna's reach extended far beyond her walls. Priests, merchants, scribes, and even temple soldiers, loyal to her, not the king, acted as conduits. Every ritual, every offering, every hymn reinforced her authority. Even marriages were tools. Enheduanna arranged alliances between prominent families in Lagash and loyal families in UR. Fertility, lineage, and sacred duty intertwined with politics so seamlessly that the distinction between spiritual and temporal obedience blurred. A governor who resisted her subtly sanctioned marriage would find crops failing, omens unfavorable, and public sentiment turning against him. The priestess herself rarely left the temple, yet she was everywhere. Her influence threaded through markets, courts, council chambers, and temples. Messages delivered under the guise of divine will, subtle manipulations of temple offerings, and the promise of divine approval allowed her to direct cities like pieces on a board. Even kings began to realize that they were not rulers in the fullest sense. Their armies could conquer, their advisors could strategize, but without Enheduanna's sanction, their victories were hollow. She legitimized power, and in Mesopotamia, legitimacy was more enduring than steel. In private, Enheduanna meditated on the delicate balance of authority. Her words and hymns carried more weight than swords, yet she understood the fragile nature of belief. One misstep, a poorly timed ritual, a misread omen, a neglected offering, could unravel decades of influence. Every action was deliberate. Every silence was intentional. As the sun set, she ascended to the ziggurat summit, gazing over UR and the lands beyond. The city lights flickered below like stars fallen to earth, each one a witness to her quiet dominion. Kings, generals, governors, and priests all move according to the rhythm she set, often unaware that they were dancing to a song she composed. And yet, even with her meticulous control, Enheduanna understood that true power required vigilance. Rivals within the temple, ambitious governors, and kings seeking autonomy constantly tested the boundaries. Her influence was formidable, but not absolute. She relied on foresight, intelligence networks, and the gods themselves, whose favor could be invoked or withdrawn through ceremony, prophecy, and the careful timing of sacred rites. In the twilight, the city seemed calm. Traders settled. Guards returned to barracks, and the waters of canals shimmered under the fading sun. But beneath the surface, the currents of power flowed according to her design, shaping the politics of southern Mesopotamia with elegance and precision unmatched by any mortal hand. And above all, Enheduanna knew a singular truth. Kings might wield armies, but priestesses held eternity in their hands. The heart of Akkad pulsed with tension. Kings came and went, armies rose and fell, yet the true power remained unseen, ensconced in the halls of the ziggurat, in the chambers where Enheduanna conducted her sacred work. She had learned long ago that influence was most potent when invisible. The people of Mesopotamia believed in kings, in gods, in the unshakable authority of stone walls and bronze weapons. But true power, she knew, was subtler. It was the ability to shape belief itself, to intertwine devotion and obedience so thoroughly that defiance seemed sacrilege. Succession became her most intricate instrument. When a king aged or fell ill, Enheduanna's hand guided the choice of heir. Not always the eldest, not always the strongest, but the one whose soul was pliant to divine instruction. She orchestrated alliances among noble families, carefully intertwining bloodlines so that loyalty was encoded in lineage. One poorly aligned marriage, and decades of strategy could unravel. One night, a prince arrived at her chamber, escorted by a retinue of temple guards. His eyes were wide with fear, his voice barely a whisper as he spoke. "High Priestess, they tell me the gods have chosen me, but I do not feel worthy." Enheduanna regarded him calmly. "The gods speak through the temple," she said, her voice steady, "and through me. Worthiness is not your concern. Obedience is." She placed a hand upon his head, the chill of sacred metal pressing lightly against his skin. "Recite them for Nana. Let the divine will flow through you. Only then will your strength manifest." The prince obeyed, his voice trembling, yet each word seemed to imbue him with authority he did not yet understand. By morning he would appear before the court as a king in all but name, yet every motion, every decree, every glance would be echoed by the subtle guidance of the priestess. Meanwhile, Enheduanna extended her influence beyond the ziggurat stone walls. Temple scribes dispatched messages disguised as divine revelation. Cities far and wide received prophecies predicting doom for those who disobeyed the gods, and prosperity for those who aligned with the temple. Merchants found trade routes subtly redirected. Taxes and offerings flowed to loyal cities, while others faced inexplicable shortages. In one instance, a governor in Kish defied the temple's direction, attempting to hoard grain for his own city. Within weeks, drought and pestilence seemed to strike his lands. Crops failed, livestock sickened, and the population murmured that the gods were displeased. When the governor pleaded for counsel, Enheduanna's response was simple: ritual compliance or ruin. Within months, he surrendered control of grain distribution to temple officials, his defiance crushed not by armies, but by fear of divine retribution. Enheduanna's mastery was not limited to governance. She wielded knowledge like a blade. Ancient texts, hymns, and prophecies were carefully guarded. Only those she deemed worthy could interpret them. The rest remained illiterate in the language of power. A king might command armies, yet without the ability to read the sacred signs. He was blind to the true machinations of authority. She also exploited the delicate intersection of fear and devotion. The populace revered kings as divine agents, yet the priestess reminded them subtly that divine favor was not granted to rulers alone. It was mediated through the temple. A poorly timed ritual, a neglected offering, or a mispronouncement could transform a king's perceived strength into vulnerability overnight. Through this, she ensured that loyalty to the temple and to her was absolute and unquestioned. In her private chambers, she reviewed the network of influence she had cultivated. Governors, kings, scribes, priests, and merchants were all connected through a lattice of obligation, devotion, and fear. One misstep, one rebellion, would ripple through the network, but she had foreseen and mitigated each potential disturbance. And yet, even with this mastery, Enheduanna never underestimated human ambition. She understood that kings crave glory, generals crave victory, and governors crave autonomy. She used their desires against them, allowing them the illusion of choice while ensuring that the ultimate outcome served her vision of divine order. As dusk fell over Mesopotamia, Enheduanna ascended to the ziggurat's summit once more. From this vantage, she could see every city-state within her influence: Uar, Lagash, Akkad, Kish, and beyond. The lands appeared serene, yet beneath the surface, currents of obedience, fear, and devotion flowed exactly as she intended. Her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. For centuries, kings had believed themselves the apex of power, but she, a priestess, understood the deeper truth. It was not the sword or the throne that ruled, but the unseen hand that guided belief, whispered in temples, and commanded the reverence of gods themselves. Enheduanna's dominion was eternal, not because of armies or conquests, but because it was woven into the very fabric of Mesopotamian life. Every harvest, every festival, every hymn reinforced her influence, and long after kings fell, she would remain the silent force shaping the course of history. Even the most meticulously woven webs can fray. Enheduanna knew this well. Though her influence stretched across Mesopotamia, whispers of dissent had begun to stir. Cities long compliant now murmured unease, Ambitious governors tested boundaries, and rival priestesses coveted a share of her unparalleled authority. The first sign of disruption came from Nippur, a city revered for its sacred temple of Enlil. A new high priestess had risen there, young and ambitious, eager to assert her own interpretation of divine will. Messages arrived at Ur, carried on clay tablets inscribed in hurried, jagged script. The people of Nippur question Ur's decrees. The omens are unclear. Guidance is required. Enheduanna read the tablets in silence, her sharp eyes scanning every word for hidden intent. A rival priestess challenging her influence was not merely a local concern. It threatened the invisible lattice of control she had built across city-states. If Nippur broke allegiance, Lagash and Kish could follow, unraveling decades of carefully orchestrated obedience. She summoned her inner council to Ur, the scribes, acolytes, and envoys she trusted above all. "We do not respond with force," she instructed. "We respond with inevitability. Show Nippur that defiance is not rebellion, it is divine error." Through a series of carefully staged rituals, calculated omens, and prophetic proclamations, Enheduanna reminded Nippur of the god's favor and wrath. She dispatched hymns praising Enlil, while subtly questioning the city's commitment to sacred duty. Priests in Nippur found themselves reciting words not of their choosing. Merchants reported inexplicable shortages, and public sentiment began shifting almost imperceptibly in favor of compliance. Even kings noticed a change. Governors, once confident in their autonomy, now deferred to temple mandates, bowing to the subtle authority of a woman they had never seen. Enheduanna's influence was not enforced through intimidation alone. It was internalized, ingrained in beliefs of rulers and subject alike. Yet the challenge of rivals was only part of the equation. Beyond Mesopotamia's borders, other city-states observed Ur's growing dominance with suspicion. A coalition of minor rulers, jealous and wary, sought to erode her authority from outside, employing both diplomacy and espionage. Enheduanna anticipated this. For every spy, she had a counter-spy. For every emissary, a shadowed agent who reported back with every secret, every whispered plot. She also understood the limits of perception. Too much visibility could invite challenge. Too much secrecy could undermine obedience. Every ritual, every decree, every gift or warning was measured with the precision of a master strategist. And always, she ensured that the gods themselves were invoked as the source of her guidance. To challenge her was not merely a political misstep. It was sacrilege. One evening, under the pale light of a crescent moon, Enheduanna convened a private ceremony in the inner sanctum of a ziggurat. She stood before the altar, her hands raised as incense curled in delicate spirals. Clay tablets bearing the names of governors, kings, and temple officials were arranged meticulously around her. With each chant, each offering of oil and grain, she wove a network of influence invisible yet absolute, binding loyalty through faith and fear alike. A whisper reached her, a subtle disturbance in the sacred currents. A young scribe, gifted with intuition, reported a troubling rumor. A secret cabal of dissenters in Lagash and Kish, quietly questioning her divine guidance and conspiring to assert local autonomy. Enheduanna's expression remained calm, but her mind raced. She understood immediately. The illusion of absolute control was fragile. Those who sought to undermine her would act only with a veneer of divine inevitability faltered. She needed a demonstration, an undeniable reminder that the temple's authority was eternal, inexorable, and absolute. The next day, envoys were sent to Lagash and Kish bearing sacred proclamations. The words were simple yet profound. The gods have spoken. The guidance of Ur is the voice of heaven itself. Obedience is salvation. Defiance is doom. But the proclamation was paired with subtle omens. Statues mysteriously fell in Lagash. Rivers shifted slightly. Crops wilted overnight. The cities interpreted these signs not as coincidence, but as divine judgment, reinforcing Enheduanna's supremacy. Even kings could not ignore the effects. Governors bowed in obedience. Scribes corrected themselves mid-script, and priestesses from distant temples sought counsel from Ur. The city-states realigned, the network stabilized, and Enheduanna's invisible web of control remained unbroken. Yet she did not underestimate the lingering threat. Power, no matter how absolute, required constant vigilance. Rivals would rise, empires would strain, and belief, once fractured, could be rebuilt but never entirely without cracks. Enheduanna understood this better than anyone. Influence is a living force, nurtured and defended daily, as fragile and vital as the breath of the gods themselves. As the sun set over Uar, the city bathed in golden light. Enheduanna ascended the ziggurat. From the summit, she could see every river, every city, every temple under her sway. The lands appeared serene, but beneath the surface, currents of obedience, devotion, and subtle fear flowed exactly as she intended. She smiled. True power, she knew, was not in armies or crowns. It was in the unseen hands that shape belief, guide kings, and command the divine. And no threat, no rival, would ever wrest it from her grasp. The passage of years had only strengthened Enheduanna's grip over Mesopotamia. Kings rose and fell, armies marched and retreated. Yet the true current of power remained hidden in the shadowed corridors of the ziggurat. Enheduanna had perfected the art of shaping not just actions, but the very beliefs that dictated them. News from distant lands reached her chambers through a network of spies and devoted scribes. A famine threatened the outskirts of Sumer, and a rebellion simmered quietly in the marshes near Uruk. Where others might see crisis, Enheduanna saw opportunity. With careful orchestration, she turned hardship into a demonstration of divine will. Relief shipments were directed to compliant cities, while the defiant were allowed to suffer subtly so that the population believed it was a judgment of the gods themselves. A council of kings was summoned to Uar under the guise of a religious festival. They arrived adorned in ceremonial garb, each believing they were here to honor the gods. But the true purpose was far more insidious, a grand demonstration of obedience and influence. Enheduanna greeted them in the inner sanctum, her presence commanding, her voice steady yet resonant with authority. The gods have spoken, she proclaimed, and their guidance comes through this temple. Those who honor their will shall flourish. Those who stray shall face ruin. She motioned to a massive clay tablet, upon which inscriptions detailed the fates of cities that had defied temple authority. Fates of famine, pestilence, and unrest. The kings trembled, not merely from fear of divine wrath, but from the uncanny accuracy of her foresight. Enheduanna had anticipated rebellions, political marriages, and military campaigns months before they occurred, and she wielded this knowledge as a weapon. One king, from the city of Lagash, dared to speak. "High Priestess," he said, voice tight with both awe and unease, "surely the gods do not act through mortals alone. Why do you claim such authority?" Enheduanna's gaze was unwavering. "Authority is not claimed," she replied softly. "It is recognized by those who witness its manifestation. The gods act through me, not because I demand it, but because their will flows through this temple. You are here not by chance, but by divine design." Even as the kings nodded in submission, Enheduanna's mind worked on multiple levels. Each word, each gesture, was calculated to entrench obedience, to inspire loyalty and fear simultaneously. She knew that power depended not only on control, but on perception, the belief that it was absolute and eternal. Yet, even in triumph, Enheduanna remained vigilant. She understood that time and mortality were enemies of influence. To ensure her legacy, she began documenting her strategies, composing hymns, rituals, and prophecies that encoded her authority into the spiritual and cultural fabric of Mesopotamia. Future generations would unknowingly honor her designs, perpetuating her control long after her mortal life ended. But threats persisted. Secret cults, rival priestesses, and ambitious nobles always tested boundaries. Enheduanna handled them with subtlety. One insubordinate temple official vanished quietly, his disappearance attributed to divine will. Another rival priestess found her temple burned by a mysterious fire. The populace whispered that Enlil had punished her for hubris. No force was ever used directly. Obedience was nurtured through fear, reverence, and manipulation, never through overt violence. Her influence extended even to the written word. Scribes meticulously recorded her hymns and decrees, spreading them across city-states. Festivals and ceremonies were subtly modified to reflect her priorities. Children learned songs and prayers that reinforced the temple's authority, embedding devotion into the youngest hearts. Every city, every household, unknowingly bowed to the priestess's invisible hand. Yet, Enheduanna's most audacious achievement remained unseen. She controlled a succession of kings. Through alliances, prophecies, and carefully cultivated obedience, she ensured that every ruler was either pliant to her will or isolated from power. A king might wield armies, but true authority, the kind that dictated life, prosperity, and survival, remained hers alone. As she ascended the ziggurat one evening, the setting sun casting golden rays over fertile plains of Mesopotamia, Enheduanna reflected on her life's work. From the shadows of the temple, she had guided empires, shaped belief, and ensured that even the most powerful kings bowed before her unseen authority. The rivers shimmered like molten gold. The fields of grain swayed in harmony with her influence, and the people's prayers rose like incense into the sky. In that moment, she understood profound truth. Power is eternal not because it conquers, but because it shapes perception. Kings, armies, and cities were temporary, but belief could endure for generations, and she had mastered it. As the first stars appeared above the ziggurat, Enheduanna whispered a final prayer, not to the gods, but to the legacy she had built, a world in which the unseen hand, the subtle voice of guidance, and the mastery of belief reigned supreme. And in that world, she would remain eternal. Centuries passed, yet Enheduanna's influence refused to fade. Though her mortal form had long returned to dust, the echoes of her power persisted in the temples, the rituals, and the hymns that permeated Mesopotamia. She had become more than a priestess. She had become a force of history itself, a hidden architect of empires. Legends whispered her name as a shadow behind kings' crowns. Some called her the voice of the gods, others the silent hand of destiny. Scholars and scribes debated whether she had truly guided rulers or merely been a myth woven into sacred texts. Yet in every city from Uar to Nippur, kings instinctively deferred to priestesses, consulted omens, and followed divine guidance, unaware that the true architect of the decisions had been mortal once, but extraordinary. The most remarkable testament to her legacy lay in the succession of kings. Generations of rulers, whether ambitious or weak, unknowingly upheld her intricate web of influence. The boundaries of Mesopotamia shifted, alliances formed and fractured, wars erupted and ended, all subtly directed by the patterns she had established. Every action, every decree, every treaty bore the mark of her unseen hand. Even distant lands felt her presence. Traders, traveling far beyond the rivers, carried hymns, prayers, and tales of her wisdom, embedding her authority into cultures she would never see. Enheduanna had become a living shadow of civilization, guiding not with armies, but with perception, belief, and devotion. Yet her legacy was not without its whispers of fear. Secret societies of priests claimed she had harnessed powers beyond mortal comprehension, that she could peer into the hearts of men and bend them without their knowledge. Children spoke of her in hushed tones, and storytellers warned of the priestess who would control kings, unseen but absolute. The line between myth and reality blurred. Her story became a lesson, a warning, a ghostly hand shaping minds long after she had passed. In the hidden recesses of ancient temples, her name was invoked not as worship of a deity, but as a reminder of the power of influence. Kings, even when unobserved, made decisions with a subconscious fear of her judgment. Governors aligned policies to favor her decrees, even centuries after her death. The unseen hand she had built continued to guide Mesopotamia, shaping history without a single sword, without a single crown of her own. Some scholars would later discover clay tablets attributed to her, hymns and personal writings that chronicled strategies for controlling not through force, but through psychology, ritual, and belief. Her insights transcended time, proving that the true power of a ruler or priestess was not measured in armies, but in the ability to orchestrate perception, devotion, and obedience. And yet, even in her perfected legacy, there was caution. Enheduanna had learned, in her final years, that absolute control is never complete. Human desire, ambition, and fear are currents that shift and twist, resisting even the most masterful guidance. So she built redundancies, layered rituals, and encoded subtle lessons for generations to come, a system resilient enough to endure, flexible enough to adapt, and invisible enough to survive scrutiny. As the sun set over the fertile lands of Sumer, the ziggurats cast long shadows across rivers and fields, echoes of a priestess's influence stretching farther than any army or empire could ever reach. Kings continued to rise and fall, but the unseen hands that guided them endured. Enheduanna, though gone, was eternal, not in flesh, but in the minds, hearts, and faith of those who believed, willingly or unknowingly, in the power she had wielded. In the end, history itself bowed to her vision. The priestess who controlled kings had not merely ruled Mesopotamia. She had shaped the very nature of power, influence, and belief, leaving a legacy that would haunt civilizations long after the rivers had changed course and the cities had crumbled to dust. Her name became legend, her methods a blueprint of subtle dominance, and her presence a whisper across millennia. True power lies not in conquest, but in control over the minds and hearts of those who believe themselves free. And somewhere in the hidden corners of Mesopotamia, the shadow of Enheduanna still watches, eternal and unseen, the ultimate arbiter of kings and destiny alike.